In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, laudate Jesus Christ.
In secula.
This is Timothy Flanders with the Meaning of Catholic. Jesus is King. Welcome to the Terror of Demons morning show. Joined as always by co-host and the author of the book, Kennedy Hall himself. Are you keeping it real over in Canada?
Yes, and longtime fans of this show will recognize my new setting. I'm up back in the kitchen where I spent many months. I just
this is classic Kennedy Hall right here.
Yeah,
in the kitchen. You got your espresso or your
No, I bounce back and forth between the stovetop espresso and the French press. I kind of love both. So I do one. It's weird. It's almost like a hobby. I get into one for a while and then I move on to something else. So I'm back to the French press for the last couple months, just so everyone knows.
Right on.
But you can see my Berkey, and maybe anyone listening has a Berkey. You can see that over my right shoulder there. That's our water purifier thing. It's old school. It's like the company's from the 1830s, and you can purify even rainwater or pond water, and you can drink it out of that thing. Not that we do that, but it's just a cool thing we use for our water. And I'm back up here because
don't you have many babbling brooks in the Great Lakes of Canada?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's like Northern Michigan. We've got all the same type of stuff, but we're on city water, so I wanted to get one of those things a little while ago. And but we're in transition because we're getting ready for a move and all that sort of stuff. So my basement is in disarray at the moment, so it wasn't going to look good on camera. So I moved back up here for this morning.
Right on. Word
so
up.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, just a reminder, you just heard the sweet sounds of Vivaldi's Laetatus Sum. I need to start introducing the music because so many people ask about the music. And just so everyone knows, all the music is always linked below in the show notes. So that was Laetatus Sum. And there's a great YouTube channel called Voices of Music.
Yes.
That they do a lot of Baroque music. And it's a lot of great stuff and a lot of great videos. I show my kids. I've got this classical for kids playlist that I like to show my kids because then they can watch the performers perform and listen to the music at the same time. But there's a lot of tracks from Voices of Music. But let's see. Today is the 3rd. Let's see. My calendar's messed up. The 27th of September. It is the 18th week after Pentecost. Cosmas and Damien today. We also have St. Wenceslas and Michaelmas is Wednesday. Very exciting feast day, which we'll talk about in a second. And we have St. Jerome. And then we also have the Holy Guardian Angels on Saturday. So wonderful, wonderful week filled with angels. So we've got Michaelmas. I've already discussed we're going to make a Satan pinata for the Flanders family. Have my sons beat it up, get some candy. We've got basically, I don't know what you do, Kennedy, in terms of celebrating Catholic feast days. We have basically one family friend. We have another family of 5 or 6. But the children, their kids are friends with our kids. We all get together to celebrate a feast day. So it's just a little gathering, nothing really big for these feast days, like the ones that are like once a month, that type of thing. So just reinforcing for the kids that this is a big day. We're going to celebrate. We're going to do special stuff for it. We're going to play games or whatever, candy, etc., like we'll do for Halloween.
Yep.
But what do you do, Kennedy, in terms of making these things special for the kids?
Very similar. Very similar. One of the things about joining a traditional community is, and just general faithful Catholics and Christians, I guess, in general, is that you make a lot of really great friends. So we've made a lot of really great friends over the last, actually, our social life, weirdly, has become so much more fruitful since the lockdown started, in a sense, because people who were sane wanted to be around other sane people. And not just that, but the support, like the times have been hard. I mean, I know I talk about it too much, but we have not had a time of reprieve since this thing started. There has not been even a 2-month period, Wow. Most places, I think every state, even California, I think had a reprieve for a bit. We have not had a reprieve at all since, in some way. So, it's been good to make friends who are there for you, and especially because a lot of families have split because of this thing, for lots of reasons. And so, we spend, I won't say their names because, people don't necessarily want to be public, but we've got a group of friends that are really, really close with, and some of them we even spend holidays with, especially this last year and a bit where families weren't getting together for holidays. Other friends would, and so we've got some friends, and we'll do something. We're actually moving 2 days before Halloween. So we're moving on the 29th of October. So I don't know what we're going to do then. But Canadian Thanksgiving is in a couple weeks. So we'll have friends we'll be with then. And then for Michaelmas, we have never done the piñata thing. I learned that from you last year. My wife will probably figure something out, but we're in transition with moving right now. So it's lots of boxes all over the place. So we're not really going to be hosting anything. But one thing that's great about our parish is we had a really great Assumption Festival this year. It was unofficial or whatever. I think we're still allowed to have gatherings outside. I think, I don't know.
And that's a big French thing, right? The Assumption.
European in general. So in Italy, Italy Day is the 15th of August, Ferragosto. And it's the Assumption. And it's same in France, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I believe the 15th in France is a big deal. So we had a really big festival at our chapel. Lots of things going on. There were games and sports and potato sack races. And, the priests were out there in their cassocks with the 3-legged races with everybody and stuff. It was really great. So we have a really vibrant community where we do a lot of fun stuff like that.
That's great. I know one thing, is to eat poultry on Michaelmas, because they're the wings, obviously the right. Angels and the wings. So some kind of poultry. In North America, we've got turkeys and chickens. Those are our main poultry. We don't have a lot of geese that we eat like in England, or I'm not sure if the continent eats geese as much. But to our Aussie brethren, what are y'all doing for Michaelmas? What poultry is in Australia? We're still learning about the Australian geography.
Is it emus?
Emus? I don't know.
Do they eat emu? Is it emus in Australia?
They have kangaroos, right? Koala bears.
If you put some wings on them, you put some wings on them.
all the Aussies are laughing at us. I'm just an ignorant American, and America's the best, so I don't need to know about it at other countries. That's
right.
American there you go. So this week on 1 Peter 5 podcast, we are announcing our new contributing editor later today, which is very exciting because this individual is a wonderful human being and wonderful scholar. So we're really happy to have him join 1 Peter 5. And we're also going to talk about the Holy Face devotion against the Marxists with RTF Mike.
Oh yes, he's the best.
That'll be in a few days. He's has a great devotion to the Holy Face, and this is exciting because I don't really know much about this devotion and the history, so that'll be fun to talk about that with him. Other than that, I think we have an article from Kennedy Hall coming.
We do.
Is that correct? Okay, so stay tuned for that. Kennedy Hall has an article. And Michaelmas. Let's see. What anything happening with you, Kennedy? The Kennedy profession. Anything you can?
Oh, I'm going to be.
Steven
launching.
says yes. There's emu, but most folks just eat plain old chicken.
Yeah.
In Australia. Thank you, Steven. Shout out to the land down under.
Yeah, Australia. It's funny. Little Australia story. If you go out west to Whistler, BC, or Big White, BC, Big White is a big mountain in Kelowna. Prawns on the barbie, shrimp on the barbie.
Yes, the seafood is big. Melbourne and Sydney. Prawns on the BBQ.
Yeah.
So prawns is that's shrimp.
Oh, okay. It's big shrimp. Yeah.
I like some shrimp on the bobby.
Yeah,
definitely. I'm from the Midwest, so we don't really like fresh seafood from the fresh waters that we have. But
so tell me this, speaking Mr. Midwest over here, I knew we were going to be friends one time when you said pop, because that's the way you're supposed to say it. Soda is a heresy. But I was reading Little House on the Prairie to my kids. I learned a lot about the United States from reading these old books. Okay, and in one of the books in the series, it was oyster crackers and oysters was like some Christmas tradition that they were. Is that a thing still, where you have like frozen like oysters at Christmas in the Midwest?
Oh, that's funny. No, I've never heard of that before.
Okay, that was something that was like a big deal in the story. Like, like he went to town to get them, and like that was the thing. And obviously they wouldn't have been.
It was probably. I mean, I would guess that was more, expensive because I mean, where were they? They were living in Missouri, right? Wasn't that?
In this, they've lived in a bunch of spots. In this instantiation, they were in Minnesota.
Yeah, when I was growing up, my parents actually brought me to one of the little houses on the prairie, the real ones, because we grew up reading those books. My mom read them to us. Definitely, yeah. It's so what a great. I mean, I love that you read those to your kids, because they're just so awesome.
They are
awesome stories.
It's true. And what would you ask me before that, though?
Well, I would guess that the oyster thing was, I mean, it was a big deal because oysters, I mean, that's a seafood.
Yeah, I guess. So.
Or, a saltwater seafood.
That's right.
So you'd have to get that trained in to wherever they were in the Great Plains area.
Yeah.
So we don't really have the seafood. Sorry, I keep on saying seafood. The saltwater seafood in the Midwest would all be specially imported from, or not imported, but moved from the coast, because all our seafood is fresh water. Like we would eat bluegill, perch, bass.
Yeah,
we have salmon. We have freshwater salmon in the Great Lakes. But
same here. Yeah, you and I are only a 4-hour drive away from each other.
Is it 4? I thought it was like 6 hours. No,
it's 4 hours. I mean, if I didn't get stopped at the border, like, but because the COVID curtain, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Flanders and Mr. Hall have never met in person. One day, actually, I'll be living 5 minutes from Lake Huron when we move.
5 minutes from Lake Huron.
Yeah, so maybe we can get on a quick boat ride over.
I think that's the nice side of Huron, because on our side of Huron, it's all rocky. You probably have a nice side. I think it's probably beachy that way.
It's beachy. There are some mixed, but it's beachy. Like actually, where we're gonna live is 5 minutes from a nice, not private beach, but sort of a little town beach. It's awesome. So my boys are so excited because they love the water, and with homeschooling, it's like mom's going to take them for nature study in the afternoon to the water. Like it's really great. So, I was going to say the Australian story. Out in Canada and Australia have a unique relationship, Commonwealth countries, and that translates to certain unique visas. So it's really easy to go on work. It's really easy for most people to go on a work holiday to Australia if they want to, because they're very open to staying there for 1 year. Because they get that if you make it all the way there, you don't want to leave anytime soon, because it's like halfway across the world. But in Canada, you can very easily come over as an Aussie and work in certain places and industries for a year and qualify like that for a work visa. It's not a problem at all. So in British Columbia, there are 2 major mountains. One's Whistler, BC, which is an hour from Vancouver. So, and then there is Big White, which is in Kelowna, which is in the interior in BC. It's actually kind of a desert around there. Anyway, beautiful mountain stuff, whatever. I went to Big White once, but basically everyone who works there is Australian. Aussies. There is mountain skiing in Australia and snowboarding, and they love to get out of there to come to somewhere with winter. And a lot of them will say, you know, they want to have a white Christmas and experience that and stuff, because their seasons are actually opposite, right? So the summer's for their Christmases. So when you go, I had a friend who was named Matt, and he worked in Whistler, BC. He was a Canadian guy, but he was the only Canadian who worked there. So to distinguish him between the other Matt, they called him Canadian Matt, because everyone who worked there was Australian and no one was Canadian, even though this was, so there's actually out in, so these various cities, they call themselves sister cities and stuff. So there's a huge Aussie contingency out in BC, but it's a new crop every 12 months because they come in on visas, although it hasn't been in a while, obviously.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to take one of my rugby teams, hopefully, to Australia until that never happened, obviously, with things, but on a rugby tour. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just looking at the map, because if you're moving closer to Lake Huron, because did you say you're closer to Lake Huron or closer to Lake Ontario when you move?
Well, Lake Huron.
Oh, wow. Okay. Because right now you're really close to here, Ontario, rather. Not
well,
Huron.
I'm in between both.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm looking at Hamilton, Ontario.
That's about an hour for me.
Anyways, okay. So today's topic is Canada. In fact, Oh Canada. That is the title, which I put in the French. Canada was obviously a French Christendom before it was English speaking. And as we've discussed on this show, famously, the King George III decided to give religious toleration or freedom to the French Catholics after he received these domains after the 7 Years' War, or as we call it in America, the French Indian War. And in an act called the Quebec Act, which I believe was 1773, if memory serves. And that act, which allowed the Quebecois, the French, to continue to build their own Christendom freely to a great degree under a British crown, was a great provocation to the patriots in the United States, to such a degree that it is contained in the Declaration of Independence. It is a Catholicism and Christendom are condemned in the Declaration of Independence. Believe it or not.
What clause is that? What part is that again?
Let me read it for you. Let's see here. Let's see here. So, hold on a minute. Let me pull up my Declaration of Independence here.
So I see someone in the chat, Marcel. He says, hi from Zurich. There's a Zurich an hour, 40 minutes away from me, but it's a different one. So hello from the other Zurich, basically.
All right. So here's the clause in the Declaration of Independence condemning the Quebec Act. It says this. Now, watch for the key code word for Catholicism is arbitrary. That's the key word that's been used for 150 years at this point, condemning Catholicism as an arbitrary, tyrannical rule of papism. Here's the Declaration of Independence. So it's condemning King George for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, Quebec, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. So the absolute arbitrary rule is what they always have called Catholicism. And so,
really?
Yes. So this is, you go back to Algernon Sidney. He said his dying words, or his last testament was, I have ever fought against the arbitrary rule and papism and all this nonsense.
Now, if I was reading through Murray Rothbard, trying to understand libertarianism, and there's a
excellent.
Yeah, we'll talk about this as we go about Canadian politics. I'm trying to understand all these things because I'm trying to find a way forward here where I live. And anyway, so and I was talking to Eric Sammons about it. So in the beginning of Murray Rothbard's book For a New Liberty, the introduction is written by Hugh Rockwell, I believe. And they claim that the American tradition is a very libertarian tradition, which I guess in a sense it kind of is in the beginning, sort of. I don't know. But they seem to reject the divine right of kings, which is fine, because I think technically divine right of kings is something we technically reject in the sense it's understood, the Protestant understanding.
Divine right of kings was invented by heretics.
That's
to
right.
justify their usurpation of the church's rights. That was
right.
King James the
second. No,
second or first. I forgot. It's like 1600s, right after Elizabeth I. But yeah.
So, but from my understanding, the American tradition rejects obviously papal rule, but at the same time rejects the absolute monarchy of the divine right of kings. So is it that they're referring to the Pope, but also to that Protestant error? Is that true as well?
Sort of. And just a quick note on what I just read. So the forerunner to that statement in the Declaration of Independence is the Declaration of the Continental Congress from 1774, which condemned Parliament for, quote, establishing the Roman Catholic religion in the province of Quebec, abolishing the equitable system of English laws, and erecting a tyranny there, end quote. So that was more specific, and then it's sort of made more general or vague in the Declaration of Independence. Anyways, so basically the problem with the American Revolution is that it's basically an anti-Catholic conservative revolution is what it is. So in 1688, going back to Algernon Synod when he fought against the arbitrary rule of papism, and before that, 1688 was when the King James II was the Catholic king of England. King James I was the guy who invented the divine right of kings. Okay, so there's Catholic King of James II. He was pushed out by King William of Orange, and that starts the Hanoverian dynasty of King George I, II, and III. And so what happened was Parliament created their own absolute rule. So it was definitely an arbitrary tyranny of Parliament in 1688, where the king was just a pawn of the Parliament, and this was what was happening for the next 100 years. And and this is what John Locke wrote his second treatise on government, which influenced Thomas Jefferson, to justify this usurpation of the Catholic King James II, who was going to establish an absolute tyranny of Catholicism in England. So what happened was King James III. So at the time of the American Revolution, he started to act like a real king. Okay. Meaning he was just trying to basically have any power and not just be a pawn of the Parliament. So he was trying to actually impose rules and do things. And obviously he gave toleration to these Canadians, to these Catholics. So that was a big provocation. So the American patriots and the 13 colonies are thinking, wow, this is terrible, because the absolute rule of Parliament is now being usurped by the king. Yep. But in reality, he's basically just acting like a normal king to have any power whatsoever. Now,
so I would say, it's funny. One of the reasons why I've been reading this libertarian works is because to get kind of like the third perspective, I guess, if that makes sense, on stuff, because it's kind of in the middle, or it's not really in the middle, it's just kind of outside of it. And it's been a mess since like the Protestant revolt, essentially. Like that, people don't realize just how much that not just changed up the religious structure, but it changed up the civil structure. And there's been this constant, almost like it's almost like the pipes are leaking and they're trying to patch them up with duct tape or something. There's been this constant patchwork way of trying to understand how to run a civil society since then, because there has been a lack of continual order amongst all levels of government, and just non-governmental levels as well, just the sort of levels of functioning society and things. So it's interesting to look at, the glorious revolution, so-called, in England. It's like you're just revolting against yourselves 100 years after you revolted against the church, and then you experience a revolt 150 or 120 years later in one of your colonies, and then continual revolts in England, and so on and so forth. It's amazing how that keeps happening.
Yeah, these revolutions do not create an alternative order. They create a disorder, which is anti-Catholic, which is based on voluntarism instead of logos. This is what I discuss in my book. So this happened already in England. So they created an absolute rule of parliament versus an absolute rule of the king.
Yeah.
And then they just fought each other, which led to civil war. And eventually the so-called glorious revolution, the ugly revolution of 1688. So the American Revolution was an attempt to maintain the anti-Catholic disorder that had been created by 1688. So it is a conservative revolution to maintain the order, but the order itself was an anti-Catholic disorder that is trying to maintain. So this is the and then to make things even more complicated, not only do the French Catholics reject this because they understand that the patriots are just manipulating them to get power, basically, and they're condemning Catholicism and all this. So Bishop Briand of Quebec excommunicates John Carroll, who will eventually become the first bishop of the United States. But the Carroll family realizes that they have an opportunity to win freedom of religion for Catholicism by supporting the patriots. So they actually joins the other side of the patriots. And the funny thing is they do end up actually with a better position in the colonies after the revolution. So there is a certain amount of good that comes out of the revolution for Catholics because now they can build churches, they can hold office and whatnot. So it's kind of like a both hand. That's why it's so complicated. It's not just like the American Revolution is like sort of this Masonic plot or whatever that exists. It does exist, but it's not all. There's also some good out of it too. So it's a very complex thing. But in Canada, at least the church could continue as the church. And there was a certain amount of a settlement between the English loyalists who fled the United States into Canada. It's a big contingent of English loyalists and French Catholics. So there's sort of this settlement that allows them to coexist, not without tension, obviously. But what's interesting in Canada is that there's this settlement and allowance for Catholicism, but not only Catholicism, but Christendom, for building Catholic society, going and converting all these Indian tribes. As I read in the Catholic Encyclopedia, by 1900, half of all the Indians in Canada were Catholic.
And that's still, generally speaking, the case as far as baptisms go. It's this Illuminati book that I will get out one day in my life, I promise. Reading about Freemasonry, it's been an eye-opener. It's very strange because, you have to be careful because on the one hand, you don't want to sound like you're doing quote-unquote apologetics for it, but the American Whig version was very different than the continental French Revolutionary version in Europe. It was just a radically different thing when you read the charges of the Masons in England. When you read the charges of the Masons in America, when they reprinted the English Masonic literature, it was an error. Obviously, it's a religious indifferentism, so it's an error. However, it was not revolutionary in the governmental sense. It was actually all about, the charge of the Freemason is to obey civil authority. It's very much not like go chop off the heads of all the Catholics in this countryside. Obviously, the intellectual errors are there, so that leads to problems. So it's funny to see the claims of the American revolutionaries. A lot of it is them revolting against things that I also disagree with, but they're not seeing the fact that the revolt has led them to this revolt. So they're revolting against the arbitrary rule of arbitrary parliaments, and it's like, yes, I also believe that's bad, but where did that come from, and why is that the case? It's a very funny thing, and that I think will lead us into our discussion of Canadian politics and what has happened to my country and where we are today.
Yeah, so Kennedy, can you just summarize, if you can, what I understand is that there's always been this strong Catholicism, especially in Quebec, and really a Catholic society to a great degree, a Christendom in French Canada, in places like Quebec or in various places like Manitoba with the Catholic Indians. But that obtained until the 1950s with the Quiet Revolution.
60s. Yeah. So Quebec, the one fatal flaw for Quebec that was its downfall, hopefully they'll have a revival one day, I guess we all will, because the reign of peace and all that. I mean, there's various prophecies about what should happen eventually. But anyway, naturally speaking, the downfall for Quebec was that it was not its own sovereign nation. So Maurice Duplessis was the best politician that you'll find in Quebec, which is why all the politicians today say that he was a dictator. That's probably a good sign. He ran Quebec almost like Salazar ran Portugal, except without a military. So it was completely all just parliamentary maneuvering. One thing I want to say before we continue with the political conversation as well is I'm getting a little bit tired of trad pessimism about politics. And the reason, what I mean by that is, of course, everything is bad. I get it, like there's problems and all this sorts of stuff. But I think it's unhelpful. Like, is democracy, as in the purest sense, is that the best form of government? Of course not. But if it's the form of government that you're dealing with, that is what it is. There's nothing else you can do, unless you'd like to go to a massive bloody rebellion revolution, which is very, very rarely justified by Catholic moral theology anyway. So we have the system we have. Voting is the way that we live. It is what it is. So you can either find a way to make something positive out of it, or you can just be a whining person on Twitter. So that's kind of my understanding of that. So I'm going to talk about politics as if it actually matters and as if there's ways you can actually do things, because if I didn't believe that, then what would be the point of trying at all? That's kind of how I look at it. So Quebec was not a sovereign nation. Well, it was obviously long ago. It was France. So when the paradox of the English Empire is it's hot and cold. It's on the one hand very evil, and people love to point that out. On the other hand, it's very good, and it's done a lot of amazing things for the world. The English, when they beat the French at the Plains of Abraham in the 1700s, they very much, after that, still facilitated the growth of Catholicism unfettered in Quebec. And Quebec was the last great European nation, in a sense. I mean, it didn't start falling till basically the Second Vatican Council figured that out. But it was like, Quebec was exporting priests all over the world. Marcel Lefebvre used to take visits to Quebec and would be in the local newspaper, the Le Devoir, the big Montreal newspaper, writing op-eds and things, if you can imagine. You can still find them from the 1970s and stuff when he was before. Anyway, so Quebec is a very interesting place historically. Now,
and just a question for non-Canadian geography, especially. We've got the Quebec province.
Yeah.
And then we've got two major cities, Quebec City and Montreal. Quebec City was the one, I believe, founded by Champlain as a Christendom, if I recall. We have a whole discussion with Charles Coulombe on this, French Catholicism in North America. But when you say Quebec, are you talking about Quebec City or Quebec province?
Quebec province. So it was called New France, Nouvelle France.
Okay, so basically, this whole section of Canada, which is called Quebec. Okay.
So when Canada was founded in 1867 by Adam Smith John A. Macdonald was the first prime minister. He was a Whig Mason Scotsman. There was New Brunswick, there was Nova Scotia, there was Quebec, and there was Ontario. Ontario was called Upper Canada. Quebec was called Lower Canada. Had nothing to do with status. I don't know why. I don't know how that worked. So Nova Scotia, New Scotland, even though it's a Latin word, okay. And then New Brunswick is New Brunswick. New Brunswick is very French. Fredericton, right on the border there with, I think it's right on the border with Florenceville, Quebec, Florenceville and New Brunswick. And anyway, they're very close to each other. So that was Canada 1867. Canada was a Commonwealth nation, and so on and so forth. Canada expanded mostly, and for Lyndon Purdy, our mutual friend, would also comment on this, but outside of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland is a little different story. Most of Canada is like the Dakotas. What I mean by that is it's all just expansionist territory that not artificial. I don't want to say it in that rude sense, but planned. It was like, we're going to go out that way with a massive infrastructure effort and make a society. It didn't. Obviously, all exploration is like that to a degree, but there was, I mean, basically early 1600s, you have settlements starting in Quebec. So there was an organic growth for a couple hundred years in Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So you see very old cultures there. Whereas when you go out west, it's all very new. There were very few native tribes in most of the areas because the area was very harsh climates and things. So those cultures are a lot younger, and you see those provinces being built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and being incorporated into the Dominion, and a very, again, not artificial in the sense where I mean it's not real, but in a sense of it was planned. Okay. So Canadian politics is very different than American politics. Obviously, there's general similarities. There's liberal and conservative. Those are our two major parties. They're actually called liberal conservative. That's generally speaking what you get in a post-revolutionary society is a left and a right. But there's also, it's a multi-party system. So there's the New Democrat Party, which is essentially the Bernie Sanders party. So they're actual committed leftists and socialists, social democrats, whatever you want to call them. Whereas the Liberal Party historically is essentially, in theory, a centrist classical liberal party. So even 10, 15 years ago, to be honest, you could see why someone who was a Catholic, in a sense, might vote liberal, kind of like you could see 15, 20 years ago, someone who was a Catholic might vote Democrat, because being pro-life was not anathema. The cultural Marxism was not obvious. It was just a classical liberal approach to governance, if that makes sense. Whereas the conservatives are historically much more after the Burkean sort of conservatism, although they've become leftists as well. So another major party in Canada is the Bloc Quebecois. It's literally the bloc for Quebec. And like an Eastern Bloc sort of sense, they recognize they want a Quebec nationalism. They only run candidates in Quebec. Canada has 338 seats. You have to get 170 in order to have a majority government. For those who don't know, a majority government is different than a minority government. Majority basically means it's a lot easier to pass laws and you can do much more. Minority means it's very difficult to do anything. So did Trudeau win the other day? Yes, but he won a minority. Doesn't really mean anything. He already had a minority. The only reason why Trudeau's been able to walk around like a dictator for the last 19 months is because they declared a state of emergency. And under the state of emergency, you can do a lot of spending and all those sorts of things. And as Marxists tend to do, they lie to their teeth. So they've been spending for the so-called pandemic, but doing that for things that have nothing to do with pandemics. That's been
okay. Okay, so just point of clarity. So if anybody throws around the term minority government, it's just referring to the fact that the president does not have the seats in parliament to support his own party.
Not without, yes. So in a minority, in order to pass stuff through in parliament in general, you have to have a certain amount of votes in order to pass a bill through, like you do in Senate and House. However, our Senate is not elected. Our Senate is appointed. So pros and cons to both. The pro to an appointed Senate is that different prime ministers appoint different senators and they get to work for life, essentially. I think they can retire at 75 if they want. So you don't have a flip-flopping of your Senate as often because it's not about popular support. It's about so-and-so appointed. The theory behind appointing senators is a good theory. It's kind of like the old aristocracy in the good sense of the word, where, you know, usually people historically who've been appointed to the Senate have proven themselves to be really upstanding, noble, honorable businessmen or something like that, or statesmen or whatever they were. So you want to put somebody there who's going to have the best interests of Canada, and they're not worried about getting reelected, which is a huge deal. And actually, to be honest, even today in Marxist Canada, senators are a wild card, because there can be so-and-so who's a liberal, but like he's been in the Senate for 30 years. He's 82 years old. But he's actually a classic liberal. So the liberals think they have him. And then it's like, no, I'm not a Marxist. I'm a classic liberal. Like, I'm not going to sign this crazy bill. So the Senate actually is kind of a wild card. So with a minority government, the parliament, the idea behind a minority government is that because obviously the will of the people is not to have, there is no major will of the people behind any one candidate, hence the minority. You would have had the majority if they all wanted you. So you have to get the support of everyone else who's not in your party in order to vote something through to get it to the point where it goes to the Senate. this is a good thing insofar as it basically makes a stalemate, and stalemate in government is better than anything else because that way there's not consistent change. So Trudeau has a minority. Okay, so there was a lot of talk, for example, a couple months ago about this big censorship bill. The censorship bill actually died in the Senate. Okay, so again, this is where the thing comes. So today, the Canadian landscape for politics, out of 60 seats in Quebec, over half are by the Quebecois, Bloc Quebecois, which means over half of the members of parliament, of federal parliament in Quebec, are basically Quebec nationalists or separatists. The Liberal government has about 158 seats overall in the whole country. The majority of that actually comes from the Greater Toronto area, which if you win the Greater Toronto area, it's like winning California in a federal election in the States, where it's just so many seats that it's remarkable. The Conservative Party of Canada has really moved to the left and has lost. It still had more popular support than Trudeau, just because everyone hates Trudeau. But his voting, as I said, was to key areas with lots of seats. And they got about 121 seats. And they, but now there's a mutiny brewing amongst the Conservatives. This was sort of the last chance for them. If they don't get rid of their leader now, Aaron O'Toole, then I would imagine that we're going to have another breakaway party. Anyway, and then the New Democrat Party, they do well in Western Canada. In Western Canada, the Liberal Party does not do well because Pierre Trudeau was Justin Trudeau's father. Pierre Trudeau was a very smart man, but he was an evil man. Hence, he raised Justin, and but he was very smart. Like he was like Barack Obama. He was like actually an accomplished scholar and was smart as a whip, but he was a Marxist, and so he really screwed over Alberta. Pierre Trudeau did with sharing of wealth from oil and things like that, and to be honest, if Alberta didn't have to give all that money away, they could buy the entire country, and I think that's why he did that. Pierre Trudeau also was part of the. Speaking of Quebec, there was a contingency, just like in France. Okay, so Quebec is France. I mean, historically, right? It's got a French. It's like a mini France. So just like in France, where you had, if you look at the time of the Revolution, you had this upper crust of society that went from being an aristocracy to an oligarchy. You have this upper crust in France that basically sells out the French people and leads to the revolution, which destroys traditional France. You had something similar in Quebec, where you had the liberals, who were committed liberals, let's say in the ideological sense of the word, who were wealthy French-speaking businessmen from the Montreal area, who would consistently work against they would work against the benefit of true Christendom Quebec, with the intention, at least in the minds of the people, of modernizing and so on and so forth, as that was always the case. So Trudeau's family is linked to that. So his dad is French Canadian, but they don't love him in France. And someone said, I thought Trudeau was French. Justin Trudeau is from Ottawa. They do not accept him as French in Quebec. He does not speak like a Quebecois Frenchman. He grew up going to an English-speaking public school, but he's perfectly bilingual. But he's a poser. Justin Trudeau, he's an actor. No, seriously, they hate him in Quebec. He is like, leftists love him because leftists like idiots and power. But he is not a. Yeah, Connor says, bring back Maurice Duplessis. Yeah, he was the last great. We talked about him with Charles Coulombe a lot. So the Canadian political landscape today has another wild card, and it's called the People's Party of Canada. That's the party that I support.
Before you get into that, let me just clarify. So you said that there's 60 seats in Quebec. Ottawa, the federal government, 60 seats from Quebec, yes. And over half of those are Quebecois nationalists.
Yes.
And do they want to secede from the Union and make Quebec as its own nation? What does that mean? Really?
There have been 2 referendums. Quebec was going to split from Canada if not for a 0.25% in the referendum.
Wow.
This happened in the 1990s.
Wow.
I don't know how that would work. The funny thing is, in Quebec, you actually have English-speaking separatists. So Montreal is 50-50 English French, but Montrealers are Montrealers. Montreal is older than Toronto, and Montreal was the economic powerhouse of Canada until the Quiet Revolution happened in Quebec, which made it more hostile place to do business for English speakers. So then Toronto was built up. So they actually screwed over Quebec by doing so. It's the political landscape in Canada is different than the States because we have a major conservative and a liberal, but we also have smaller parties which wield a lot of power. Okay, it's truly a multi-party system. But this is something I was thinking about last night to try to explain what's happening right now in Canadian politics and why it's important. I don't know if any of the listeners are familiar with Alexander Dugin. He's a Russian philosopher. I have not read all of his works, so if he has some wacky ideas, everyone just relax. I've just looked at some of it. But one of the things that I think is very bang on in his works is he breaks down society. His book is called The Fourth Cultural Revolution, I believe. No, The Fourth Political Revolution. The Fourth Political Theory. There you go. One of the main idea that I find most fascinating in his works, which I think is bang on, is he breaks down society into traditionalism and modernity. And he's talking, generally speaking, about tradition writ large, culture writ large. So he looks at a Chinese traditionalism, a Russian traditionalism, an Indian traditionalism, French traditionalism, and so on and so forth. It's irrespective of religion, but it's religious, but it's not like he's advocating for one. He himself is a committed Russian Orthodox, but that's neither here nor there. So, but from a political perspective, he says it's not about time. You could be a contemporary modern day culture, but a traditional culture, versus you could be a modern culture 300 years ago. Basically what he means is traditionalism being you have the religious, economic, familial, and so on and so forth, traditions of your society, and that's how you have stability. And then modernity is essentially revolution. That's how he looks at it. It's quite an interesting theory. He used to be really hard on America. Shocker, a Russian was not a huge fan of America, but he used to be really hard on America. His book came out, the one that I'm talking about, I believe 2009. So it was after years of Clinton and Bush and then Obama. And he basically thought this place is a secular despot wasteland. Now, with the Trump phenomenon, his mind about America really changed. Not because Trump was the savior or anything like that, but what he saw, he realized there really was an American traditionalism. For better, for worse, America is an old enough country now where the national myth, the ethos, has so ingrained in the people that it is almost like a religious truth for those who believe and love America, the patriots, essentially. He saw that as a very positive thing because traditionalism everywhere is always the enemy of globalism, which is true. Okay. In this grand scheme of things, you would prefer, let's put it this way, you would prefer a Whig Freemasonic traditionalist American culture to Barack Obama's America, right? Like certainly.
Yeah. I would take that.
Yeah, because one of them is much closer to sanity and natural law than the other. Canada is just now, in my opinion, outside of Quebec, discovering its traditionalism. We never had this because, again, outside of Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Canada was artificially made. Again, I don't mean that in a rude sense, but just it was a business endeavor. It was literally a corporation. Much of Canada is literally a corporation. That's how it started. The Hudson Bay Company. Canada is a corporation historically. So, however, Canada at the same time, over the last 120 years, has experienced 130 years, has experienced a massive influx of immigration. Now, for a time, the immigration was very selective, and everyone who immigrated to Canada, this is where Lyndon Purdy's background comes from, Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans and so forth, were sent out to the West because the people from the Asian steppe, the Eurasian steppe, had similar farming practices. They could go out and they could cultivate wheat in the middle of Manitoba because it was a similar weather to what they had in, northeastern Ukraine. So they were sent those places. So it was Christian, but it was not one monoculture. So now 120 years later, throughout all of Canada, you've basically had now, the parents were coming over in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You basically had 3 or 4 generations that have come through who are now established in places where their culture is now becoming something like organic, if that makes sense. It's that's even in the Bible, right? I mean, Moses talks about basically the laws of immigration. It's not until the third or fourth generation that you become a citizen. There's practical reasons for that. Okay, we're kind of now just coming to that point where you can say that a family that's been here for 130 years really is Canadian, whatever that means. It's that everything else is kind of rooted out of it, and it's just now that's what they are, and that's fine. That's good. You want to have the organic society if you can. So we have a strong globalism at the same time in Canada. So basically, Canada is going through, nationally speaking, its own quiet revolution. That's my opinion. And it's been thrust upon us by the COVID regime. The COVID regime obviously represents much more than COVID. And in every country, this is manifesting a little bit differently. In countries that are having pushback against this, Italy, other places, for example, what they're doing is they're rediscovering their political traditions. We don't really have a political tradition writ large to rediscover, nationally speaking, outside of Quebec. So we're kind of discovering for the first time and working out what does it even mean to be a Canadian in a sense of traditional culture. So it's a very fascinating time, in my opinion. And this has been personified by the People's Party of Canada, who they did not win any seats, but they did have the highest vote count of a small party. So they had almost 1 million votes. Put it this way, the Green Party had 200,000 votes, but still won 2 seats because there was 2 towns where they got like the whole town. But there's been a major shift in the consciousness of Canadian voters. I've talked to a bunch of people who voted Conservative, and they said it was a debate for them whether to vote for the People's Party or the Conservatives. They just wanted to get Trudeau out, was how they thought of it, but they really did support them. So there's this massive groundswell right now of a populism. But what's happening is I've been to these rallies and talked to these people. We're trying to figure out what does that mean. So when you go to these places, essentially what you find is you find Christians and you find basically people who are inspired by the classic Whig liberal tradition. So they may not be religious, but they believe in the Constitution, whatever that means. And there's this interesting union happening between these two groups where they all recognize that they want to live in a moral and free society in the truest sense of the word of don't tread on me, get off my back like you crazy wackos.
Local rule, like subsidiarity. Yeah.
Yes, literally. So the momentum from the election, there was no real change at all. Like pretty much every seat was the same. Nationally, nothing really changed. It was a big disaster. It was no point. $500 million to find out that people in power are still the same ones. Everyone's very upset about it. So the political scene right now in Canada, we're going through a moment where I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday after Mass. We're basically unofficially deciding whether or not we're even a country anymore. There's no binding myth for the country as a whole. It's not there. The British North America Act was it was significant, but it was very peaceful. Is good in a sense, but there's no binding myth. It's not like we can all say, "Oh no, we all go back to the founders." It's like no one can even name like 2 founders because they were basically businessmen who signed onto a document making corporations part of a bigger corporation. There was no constitutional movement at the beginning of Canada. It was just common law, and sort of we peacefully became our own country. So it's been very interesting to see what's been happening. So right now, this is why I've been reading libertarianism. The only, in my opinion, this will upset so many trads, but it is what it is. The only practical or pragmatic way forward for Canadian political activity is something like a libertarianism, because the revolution is so great, the overreach is so steep. The only way right now forward at all is finding ways to have less of the government in your life. That's the only way to breathe, essentially. That's what's happening. So it's funny. I've been reading through Murray Rothbard, okay? And some things he says I don't agree with, of course. However, all of his critiques of whatever state he's critiquing, whether that was real or imagined to him at the time, he's describing Canada. So I'm reading through this and I'm going, yeah, check. This is all the things. And so that's what we're seeing right now in Canada is basically a movement of trying to understand what a right is, right? Because what is a right? I mean, we know what a right is. It's Catholic. It pertains a duty to it. Rerum novarum, rights and duties, essentially, right? But that's not understood, generally speaking, by people. It's understood interiorly. Why do you have a right to work? Well, I have a right to work because I have to support my family. You understand that there. Okay, your right has a duty attached to it. But because Canada has been so comfortable being on the government teat for so long, because even in conservatism in Canada is very much an English conservatism where good governance is the goal. Good governance is the goal because good governance will give you a good society, and that's fine if everyone's sane, I guess. But if they're not, then it's not fine at all, because then it's good governance. What does that mean? Our current conservative leader is pro-choice and believes in carbon taxes, essentially. It's like, you're a bloody joke. So right now, it's basically a natural rights movement. And it's interesting for me because so many of the people I talk to who are doing amazing things, like really are doing good things to help people, they're reading the American founders a lot, because we're kind of having our revolution against the oligarchical vestige of the crown, in a sense. So I'm very conflicted right now, because on the one hand, as a Catholic looking at history from my broad view, I have a lot of problems with some of these ideas. On the other hand, living on the ground, looking at option sane versus option insane, option sane sounds a lot like American classic liberalism. And that's kind of where we are right now. And the People's Party of Canada is the representative of that. Since the election happened, the coolest thing, the People's Party got no seats, but they got lots of votes nationally. And that kind of showed us something. There's like 1 million of us in this country who are actually all united in sanity. We just now have to build something with that. So what's been cool is when you vote and you get involved in all these things, you obviously get emails and networks and all this stuff. So the People's Party is still pushing forward. There'll be another election in 18 months because Trudeau said he would call another one if he didn't get his way. He's going to have a tantrum. You can call a snap election if you have a minority government. He's going to do that. So now the next goal is all of these, let's say, classic libertarian types, is how do we support each other through unemployment as people get fired for not taking the vaccine? So weirdly, this whole stuff is actually pushing people of goodwill even closer together. So I think people need to pay attention to Canada for the next 5 to 8 years, because if you look at historically what happens in all countries with major, let's call them rebellions, revolutions, whatever, it's always a very small minority of people that get together. Like the Bolsheviks were like, what, 2 or 3% essentially of the national population or something, very small. I'm not advocating for Bolshevism, by the way, but I'm just saying that's what you see, for better, for worse, movements that have massive effects on the country writ large. They always start very small, because while everybody else is kind of complacent, there's a small motivated group that are pressurized for various reasons, and it causes them to punch above their weight. And I think that's what's happening in Canada right now.
Well, I think that's a great microcosm of what's happening in not every, but many different countries across the globe, is a fight between some form of nationalism or populism to try to keep the interests of the local rule in place, versus various forms of globalist international business interests, the COVID regime, etc. And so this is the battleground in every country. So very much it's God's certainly bringing good out of evil, in the sense of bringing out a consciousness of subsidiarity. That's certainly what you can see in libertarianism. Is it's just the basic root. So much of the basic root of libertarianism, which is a good thing, is that subsidiarity, the local rule. Yeah. That's the thing that we lost with the Protestant Reformation, especially, and was not really present, especially in Baroque, except in Baroque civilization. But the subsidiarity Absolutely. That is the freedom of the local rule to rule itself, which is what Catholic social teaching says is what is just, the local rule.
Yeah, that was Chesterton's shtick, essentially. So it's a very it's funny as I'm reading through these libertarian works. In fairness, at the beginning of For a New Liberty, the author looks to the 1500s as a time when civilization began to become tyrannical, which me too.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it doesn't say specifically which, but yeah, because the errors of the social kingship of Christ, and this is listen, I'm 100% an integralist. I'm 100% kind of a libertarian now. It's very weird because I have my ideals.
You're an integralist.
I'm an integritarian, libertegralist. I know some people are, I just listen.
Everybody's spitting out their coffee right now.
Yeah. But what I mean by that is the kingship of Christ is something that happens. It's like Coulomb always says, to have a king, you have to have a kingly people, yeah, obviously I would love St. Louis the 14th to just show up out of nowhere and just ride in on a white horse, take over. And that'd be awesome.
Louis the 9th, you mean? Not the 14th. He was bad.
Oh, I just meant after the 13th. I meant the next one. I'd love whatever, the 16th. I want to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know which one they're on now.
Yeah. I'd love a new one. That'd be great. But that's not going to happen in my lifetime. But aside from some sort of miracle, which I'm hoping for, I pray for the conversion of Russia and the consecration every single day. And we actually pray for it 5 times per rosary because it's after anyway. So I'm hoping for those things. But on the practical scale, I just kind of say, the revolution's happened. Now what do I do? It's like, yes, I'd love all these ideals, my friends, but they're not anywhere soon. So the enemy is what it is. Okay, now what do I do to make room for me to breathe? And that's just what I'm trying to think about. And that's what we're seeing here in Canada. And what this Skid 2041.
Here's a great quote here from Skid 2041 says this: like Emperor Joseph said to Roosevelt when asked, "What is your role in the government?" The emperor said, "To protect my people against the politicians." Mm-hmm. We no longer have anyone to protect the people. That, yes, very much the role of a king to protect the rights of his people against these oligarchs, basically. But yeah, so we're all out of time. But I think Kennedy did a great job breaking down. This is the fight in every nation. Mm-hmm. So let's pray for Canada. Let's pray for our own countries, wherever you are, to resist in whatever way possible.
Yeah.
The loss of local rule, the loss of subsidiarity, and the rights of the subsidiarity rule.
Yeah.
And if it means you become a libertarian in some way, at least practically speaking, on a practical level, to form the alliances that we need to establish these rights, then these are things that we have to do. We have to look at practical coalitions. So let's pray in Our Father, and we'll close out. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, dimitti nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.